Welcome back to the Reading Room. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're picking up with Chapter 13 of the Journal. It's one of my 3 currently released novels. I've actually got a couple more in the works, but more on those in a different video. The last chapter was Chapter 12, and we ended with kind of a cliffhanger with Heath, and they had just arrived at the archive. They were going to be searching Heath, Samantha, and James. They were going to be looking through some records, and the archives were on fire, and then there was an explosion. So we're going to pick up where we left off. Kind of. We start with the flashback with Chapter 13. So Chapter 13 is titled, "This Too Shall Pass." On April 8th, 1937, Heath found himself in the thick of a jungle, fighting off mosquitoes and trying not to get eaten by a jaguar that he was sure had been tailing him and his group for days. He had just turned 18 a couple of months prior, and a trip to the rainforest was high on his list of things he wanted to do with his newfound freedom. The past few years had been hectic, living with several foster families and never being able to truly settle down, and he was really just happy to finally make his own choice of where to be. On his birthday in January, he spotted a poster on the wall. On his birthday in January, he spotted a poster on the wall of a restaurant he was celebrating in that offered adventure to those brave enough to take risks. And he couldn't pass up the chance to get out of the small town he had spent his whole life in. Going to the address listed on the paper, he would find a rundown office building with a help wanted sign in the window that looked like it had been there for ages. Inside, an older woman with an eye patch greeted him with a smile and offered coffee while he waited for the manager to return from lunch. Looking around the room, he saw photos of various people taken in what appeared to be very exotic locations all around the world. One photo of a couple on a beach caught his eye as they were posing next to a large chest that sat open, filled with what looked like coins and precious gems. The man had his arm around the woman, and they were both smiling like they were having the time of their lives. A handwritten caption at the bottom of the photo read, "June 3rd, 1931. Ravens find the lost treasure of Andele." Other photos showed similar scenes, from beaches to jungles, a cityscape or two, and even one with 6 people dressed in heavy winter coats, standing in what appeared to be deep snow and holding up a tablet. The caption on this one read, "September 4th, 1930. Antarctic Expedition Team finds tablet of Calcus." As he was trying to make out what the tablet said, the sound of the office door opening caused him to jump. A rather large man walked into the office, greeted the secretary before realizing there was someone else in the room. Turning to Heath, a large smile crossed the man's face. "Welcome, lad. I assume you're here to find adventure." His voice carried enough baritone to wake the dead several counties over. "Yes, sir." "Stupendous! You've come to the right place. Join me in my office and we'll discuss the details." He led Heath into a small room in the back. Sitting down behind a big, dark, wooden desk, he motioned for Heath to sit in the chair across from him. "I assume you're here because one of our ads. They certainly seem to work," the man said. "Yes, sir. I saw one of your posters while I was having dinner the other night. It said you offer adventure to people who want it." "Not just want it, my boy. Those who need it. Though I should start by properly introducing myself," he said as he stretched his hand across the table. "My name is Clarius Bunby. This office is the home of Bunby Antiquities. We find even the rarest artifacts anywhere on the globe. We've found rare items on every continent, and our teams are the best in the world at what they do." He stared into Heath's eyes, the smile growing bigger on his face as he spoke. "So you pay people to travel and find things?" Heath asked, the smile on his own face showing through his attempt to hide his excitement. "And so much more. The journeys you go on here will take you to places that others can only dream of. Places that no human has set foot in thousands of years. I can't promise you fame or fortune, but I can promise that your life will be changed forever through experiences that you have here." More than ready to get away from the life he had known, Heath eagerly signed the paperwork that Clarice provided, and by late March he was setting off with the team to explore the rainforests of Brazil. They were looking for a chalice that Heath couldn't remember the name of, even though he was mostly there for the experience and wasn't expected to know much. There were 6 people on his team, including him, and he was doing his best to get to know all of them, as he assumed he would be working with many of them over the next few months while he trained for the bigger expeditions. There was Frank, who had been working for Clarice the longest and was leading the party. Next came Barbara. She had only been with the organization for about 2 years, but had quickly made a name for herself as a translator speaking 8 languages. James had been with the company for a few years and had recovered some of the rarest items in the world. He and his wife had been the go-to team for the toughest jobs until she passed away, and now he was known more for taking risks that no one else would take. Jesse was another new member, having only joined up with about a month before Heath, and was still trying to figure out if he actually wanted to be there. He had imagined luxurious hotels and amazing sights, not camping in the middle of a muggy forest with giant bugs and killer animals hiding in every bush. The last member of the group was Kyle, who was somehow more mobile than anyone else despite having one wooden leg. The expedition wasn't exactly what Heath had envisioned, but it was much better than what he had left behind. They had flown from New York and landed in Belém after what felt like months. Heath had never flown before, and the feeling was not one he was fond of, though he knew he would need to get used to flying if he planned on doing this long term. After landing, they made their way via boat to the Amazon River, finally arriving at a tiny village where they would set off into the forest. Progress was slow, to say the least, with each day of travel taking them maybe 3 or 4 miles, but now they were getting close to their objective. The final destination was a site that supposedly held the remains of a city lost to time. Jesse and Heath led the way with their machetes as Frank guided them with his compass. Finally, after about 2 weeks of walking and chopping, they found the remains of an old stone building that indicated they were in the right place. Setting up a base camp, Frank and James would plan out a search pattern while everyone else took some time to rest. The area was overgrown, but to the trained eye it was obvious there had been a great city there at some point. The group would split into teams of 2 over the next few days to map out the area and get some ideas of where to begin their search. Heath found himself shadowing James, though he secretly wished he would have been paired with anyone else. "I'm not here to babysit. If you can't keep up, I'll leave you behind. Normally, new blood stays behind at camp to tend the fire, so if you think you'll have any trouble staying close to me, I need to know now," James said as they prepared to set out for the day. "I can keep up," Heath said with a smile on his face as he imagined the older man would be the one struggling to stay with him. Setting off into the forest, Heath couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they walked deeper into the brush, the feeling became almost overwhelming, and he found himself looking all around, trying to spot their stalker. But the brush was so dense, he couldn't see anything beyond a few feet. A noise in a nearby bush caught his attention, stopping him in his tracks as he watched for movement. After a few minutes of looking around, he realized that James had disappeared. Starting to panic, he called out and received no response. He remembered from the little bit of training he had received that the best thing to do when lost in the forest was sit still and wait for help to come. But from what he had seen so far, James was more likely to assume Heath was dead than come looking for him. As he stood there trying to figure out what to do, he suddenly realized the forest had become eerily quiet. The sound of birds singing and bugs chirping had been replaced with a deafening silence, leading Heath to think for a moment that he lost his hearing. This thought would be fleeting, however, when the silence was broken by the sound of James yelling for help. Heath sprinted through the brush in the direction of the scream. Battling through leaves and a spider web, Heath soon broke into a clearing where he spotted James lying on the ground with a jaguar standing over him. Blood on his torso and legs revealed the creature had already struck several times. Pulling his machete out, Heath charged through the clearing. The animal turned to attack and was met with the sharp blade of the knife cutting into its neck. The wound was only superficial, but the big cat yelped in pain and disappeared into the jungle before Heath could get a second blow in. He had caught it off guard, and he knew that it would most likely be back very soon. Leaning down, Heath inspected James's wounds. He was unconscious but breathing. The cuts on his midsection didn't appear to be deep, though he had lost a lot of blood. Unable to wake James, Heath summoned every ounce of strength he could to lift the older man and start making his way back to camp. His eyes on the jungle around him, Heath made his way slowly in what he hoped was the right direction. After a short while, the sight of smoke from their fire told him he was almost there. Breaking through the brush that lined the edge of camp, Heath collapsed. The others had just returned and came running to assist, with Frank and Jesse carrying James to the tent while Barbara checked on Heath. It would be several days before James would wake up fully. His wounds would leave some major scars, but he would live. "I'm so sorry, James. I should have been paying closer attention and keeping up with you," Heath said when James was finally able to talk. "It's not your fault. I saw you were looking around and I wanted to have some fun, making you think you were lost. I ducked in some bushes, lost situational awareness. You saved my life. I owe you," James said. "You don't owe me anything. You would have done the same for me," he said with a slight grin on his face. Hearing James say the whole disappearing thing had been intended as a joke shed new light on who he really was. Over the next few years, James would help Heath learn the ins and outs of recovering antiquities, and the two would become close. They would nearly be killed on several occasions, but working together they would find their way out of every situation in one piece. They often saved each other, joking about who owed who their life. None of these occasions resulted in any serious injury, and James still considered himself in debt to Heath. That ledger would change on August 24th, 1964. Heath wasn't sure where he was, but he could feel an aching pain in his leg. The feeling of a mattress under him and blankets covering him indicated he was lying in a bed, but that didn't make sense. The last thing he remembered was backing out after an explosion knocked him to the ground. Blacking out after an explosion knocked him to the ground. The faint memory of seeing Samantha's face flooded in like a bad dream, and he slowly opened his eyes. Looking up, he could see the tiled ceiling above him, and a heart monitor was beeping along to his side. Trying to move, he felt something gripping his hand, and he looked down to see Samantha with her head laying on the side of the hospital bed. Her eyes were closed as she napped, and she was holding his hand in hers. He tried to speak, but quickly found that wouldn't be possible due to a tube running in his mouth and down his throat. He took in his surroundings. As he took in his surroundings, Samantha began to stir. Opening her eyes, she sat up with a look of shock and joy on her face. "You were awake. Thank God. I'm going to get the doctor." She stood up and walked briskly to the door, opening it and going into the hallway. Within a couple minutes, she had returned with a short, gray-haired man in tow. The doctor checked the machines that shined a light in Heath's eyes before asking him a couple of questions about how he was feeling. Shaking and nodding his head brought some pain, but overall he was just glad to be alive, and even happier to see Samantha there. The doctor left the room after ensuring Heath's vital signs were good, returning a few minutes later to remove the breathing tube. His throat was sore and his voice was hoarse, but he could finally speak. "What happened? Where's James?" Heath asked, barely able to get the words out. He still felt incredibly weak. "The archive building exploded. They think it was a gas leak in the basement," she said, trying to avoid looking at him. "And James?" Heath noticed she had stopped short of answering his second question. "Heath, you've been in a coma for a week. You need to get some rest and let your body finish healing. We can talk more later." A tear rolled down her cheek as her eyes locked on his. "Where is James?" He struggled to get the words out, but he couldn't let up until he knew. "James was standing next to you when the explosion happened. He was in the right place to shield you to shield us from a large piece of metal that was blown from the building. Her eyes were tearing up now, and she was having trouble speaking. James saved our lives. At this, she broke down sobbing, laying her head on the bed at Heath's side, as tears began flowing down her cheeks. He knew what she was telling him, but he didn't want to believe it. The pain he'd been feeling in his legs seemed to slip away as he let himself weep, a new pain overcoming him. After a few minutes, the tears stopped, and he could feel exhaustion setting in. Samantha, tears still running, climbed in the bed with him, and the two of them drifted off to sleep. So that was chapter 13. That was a rough one to write. It was losing James and all of that, everything that happened with Heath. Like, that was probably the thing that, like, when I write these stories, when I write these books, I see in my head the story that's happening, and I just write it out. So for me, when I got to that point, I'm like, oh shit, this is actually a thing. It's the first time. Obviously, it's my debut novel, but it's the first time that I've killed off a character, and God, it sucks. But, you know, there's still more to go. We've got chapter 14. There are 23 chapters in total. So we've got a few chapters left. There's going to be some other things I'm going to be recording as we go. Other books. I've got, obviously, GPS Signal Lost and Legends and Tales I want to do. And then some other things as well. So if you enjoy what you've seen, and if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe. Like the video. Just let me know in the comments below what you thought of the story, what you think of it so far. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts. And then join me next week if you want to see it today, or anytime before it comes out on YouTube. The chapters release a week early on Patreon, so you can head over to Patreon and you can check out the chapters over there. If you want to wait, they'll be on YouTube about a week later. But thank you all for watching. Everybody have a great rest of your day. I'll see you in the next one.